Don't. Whatever you think you know, whatever you're about to read, I need you to remember one thing first. I never lied about loving you.
Korean Mafia paid her to be his surrogate. Unexpectedly, he ended up begging for her love. The elevator doors opened onto the 40th floor with a soft chime, and Amara Chukwu stepped out into a hallway so silent it made her own heartbeat sound like a drum in her ears. Her palms were damp. In her right hand, she gripped a cream-colored envelope, the paper heavier than any envelope had a right to be, its edges slightly worn from being folded and unfolded, hidden and rediscovered. She had been told never to touch it. She had been told, specifically, by the man now standing at the far end of the penthouse in front of her, that if she opened it, everything between them would end that night. Kong Tae-min stood with his back straight and his jaw tight, the city lights of Seoul spilling gold and blue through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, turning him into a silhouette that looked less like a man and more like a warning. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. Every person who worked for him, every rival who had tried to cross him, every reporter who had tried to dig into his family's business, understood that Tae-min's silence was more dangerous than another man shouting. But tonight, his silence was different. Tonight, there was something underneath it that Amara had never heard from him before. Fear. "Put it down," he said quietly. Amara looked at the envelope in her hand, then back at him. 6 months ago, she would have obeyed him without question. 6 months ago, she had been a stranger to this penthouse, to this city, to this man who controlled more of Seoul's underground economy than the police dared admit. 6 months ago, she had walked into his world with a single goal: save her sister's life, and she had believed, foolishly, that she could do it without losing a single piece of herself. She had been wrong. "Why does it matter so much to you?" she asked, and her voice did not shake, even though her hands did. "It's just paper, Tae-min. Unless it isn't." Amara. Her name in his mouth sounded like it cost him something. "Please." He never said please. In 6 months, she had heard him give orders that made grown men flinch, had heard him negotiate deals worth more money than her entire hometown would see in a decade, had heard him threaten people so calmly that the threat became more terrifying than any scream could have been. She had never once heard him beg. She looked down at the handwriting on the envelope's face, not typed, not printed, but handwritten in a slanted, aging script, and something cold moved through her chest. "This is your father's handwriting," she said. Tae-min did not answer. "He's been dead for 3 years. Amara's fingers tightened around the paper. "So why would your dead father leave an envelope with my name on it?" The silence in the room turned into something alive, something with teeth. Tae-min took 1 step toward her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his eyes that looked almost like desperation. "Because he knew this day would come," he said. "He knew that once you found out the truth, I would lose you. And he wanted to be the one to take you from me, even from the grave." Amara's thumb slid beneath the envelope's seal. "Don't," Tae-min said, and this time his voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to hear the man underneath the empire. "Whatever you think you know, whatever you're about to read, I need you to remember one thing first." "What?" "I never lied about loving you." Amara's hand stilled. Behind her, the city of Seoul glittered on, indifferent to the 2 people standing in the dark, one of them holding the truth, the other one holding his breath. She broke the seal. Cut to black. 6 months earlier. Before we go any further, tell us, where in the world are you watching this from tonight? Drop your city or country down in the comments below, because it always amazes us how far these stories travel, from one screen to another, one heart to another. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a single moment of what's coming. Now, let's go back to where it all began. Lagos was loud in the way that only home could be loud. Generators humming behind gates, hawkers calling out prices at the top of their lungs, the smell of fried plantain drifting from a stall 2 streets down. Amara Chukwu walked through it all with her shoulders squared and her mind somewhere else entirely, because in the hospital behind her, in a small white room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, her younger sister Ifeoma was lying in a bed she could not afford to keep her in much longer. Amara was 26 years old, and she had already learned that the world did not care how hard you worked if you did not have money to show for it. She had a degree in accounting that she had never been able to use properly, 3 jobs she had held and lost in the last 2 years, and a sister with a heart condition that required surgery no Nigerian public hospital could perform in time. 6 weeks, the doctor had told her that morning, not unkindly, but not gently either. If we don't operate within 6 weeks, her heart won't hold. 6 weeks. Amara had 11,000 naira in her account and a mountain of unanswered prayers. That night, sitting outside the hospital on a concrete bench with her phone screen glowing too bright in the dark, she found the advertisement almost by accident, buried in a private forum a friend had once mentioned in passing. International surrogacy placement, discreet, well compensated, medical care included. She almost scrolled past it. Almost. But the number attached to the compensation made her stop breathing for a full 3 seconds. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was enough to save Ifeoma's life and still have something left over to rebuild whatever was left of their world after. She almost didn't send the message. Her thumb hovered over the screen for nearly 10 minutes, her mind screaming every reasonable warning a young woman raised in Lagos had been taught to scream at herself. This is how people disappear. This is how girls end up trafficked. This is exactly the kind of story your aunties warn you about at every family gathering. But then she thought of Ifeoma's face, pale and thinner every single day, and she thought of their mother, 5 years gone, who had begged Amara with her last breath to take care of her little sister no matter what it cost her. She pressed send. The reply came faster than she expected. A woman named Grace, speaking with the polished neutrality of someone used to handling delicate arrangements, explained that the client was a private, high-net-worth individual based in Seoul, South Korea, who required absolute discretion, full medical compliance, and, Grace's tone shifted slightly here, a warning wrapped in professionalism, complete cooperation with a set of non-negotiable contractual terms. He's a very private man, Grace said over the video call 3 days later, her face lit by the cool glow of an office Amara couldn't place. Some people call him difficult. I call him thorough. If you're the kind of woman who needs everything spelled out and controlled, you'll do just fine with him. And if I'm not? Amara asked. Grace smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. Then I suggest you become that kind of woman for the next 9 months. Amara nearly said no. She almost closed the laptop and told herself she'd find another way, any other way, to save her sister. But then Grace mentioned the number again, the exact figure, wired in installments, the final payment large enough to change everything, and Amara thought about the surgeon's voice that morning, calm and clinical, informing her that time was the one thing money couldn't manufacture. She signed the preliminary agreement 2 days later with hands that would not stop shaking. The flight to Seoul was the first time Amara had ever left Nigeria. She sat pressed against the window for most of the 14 hours, watching clouds shift beneath her like a slow-moving ocean, her stomach twisting between terror and a strange, fragile kind of hope. She had told Ifeoma she was traveling for a temporary work contract, a lie that tasted like ash every time she repeated it, because if her sister knew the truth, she would refuse the surgery altogether. Ifeoma had always been like that. Selfless to the point of self-destruction, exactly like their mother had been. Incheon Airport was overwhelming in its silence and its order, everything gliding with an efficiency Lagos had never bothered to pretend at. A driver in a black suit was waiting for her at arrivals, holding a small tablet with her name displayed instead of a paper sign. He did not speak much English, and Amara's Korean began and ended with the words she'd hurriedly memorized on the plane, so the ride into the city passed mostly in silence, save for the low hum of the car's engine and the glittering skyline rising ahead of her like something out of a film she had never expected to star in. She had imagined meeting a monster. Grace's careful warnings, the thickness of the contract Amara had barely had time to read, the sheer scale of wealth implied by every detail of the arrangement, all of it had painted a picture in her mind of a cold, cruel man who saw women as instruments and children as assets. The man who stood to greet her in the sleek, glass-walled office an hour later was not what she expected at all. Kong Tae-min was younger than she had pictured, perhaps mid-30s, with sharp, composed features and eyes that studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away and refuse to at the same time. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie. His sleeves rolled to the forearm in a way that suggested he had just stepped out of a meeting far more demanding than this one. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. "Miss Chukwu," he said, in English so precise it barely carried an accent. "Thank you for coming such a long way." "You paid for the ticket," Amara said. "I didn't have much choice in the manner of my arrival, only in the decision to come at all." Something flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or the faintest trace of amusement, gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. "Please, sit." She sat. He remained standing, arms folded, studying her the way a man might study a contract clause he wasn't yet sure he trusted. "I assume Grace explained the terms," he said. "She explained the money. She was vaguer about everything else. The terms are simple. You will live in my residence for the duration of the pregnancy, under full medical supervision. You will have no contact with media, no public appearances that could compromise privacy, and no interference in matters that do not concern you. In exchange, you will be paid an amount that, by your own estimation, exceeds anything you could earn in Nigeria within a decade." "You've done your research," Amara said, keeping her voice level despite the tightening in her chest. "I do not enter into arrangements without understanding exactly what, and who, I am dealing with." "Then you already know why I'm here. My sister is dying, Mr. Kong. I'm not here for adventure, and I'm certainly not here to be managed like one of your business assets." For a long moment, he simply looked at her, and Amara had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being weighed on some invisible scale only he could read. "You misunderstand me," he said finally. "I don't intend to manage you. I intend to protect this arrangement, which means protecting you for as long as you are part of it." "There's a difference between protection and control," Amara said. "I hope you understand that difference, because I won't sign anything that erases it." Something like respect moved across his face, quick and reluctant, as if he resented feeling it. "Noted," he said simply, and turned to signal an assistant waiting at the door. "Ms. Han will show you to the residence. We'll finalize the remaining details tomorrow." That night, lying in a bed larger than any room she'd ever slept in back home, Amara stared up at an unfamiliar ceiling and wondered exactly what kind of world she had just agreed to enter. She would learn, in the weeks that followed, that Kong Taemin's world was built on two things: absolute control and absolute silence, and that both were about to be tested by a woman he had never expected to actually notice. The residence itself was less a house than a museum of restrained wealth, floors of pale marble that seemed to swallow sound, walls lined with art no one ever stopped to admire, a kitchen large enough to feed 40 people that produced meals for exactly one man, eaten alone, at exactly the same hour every evening. The staff moved through the halls like ghosts, quiet and efficient, never lingering, never laughing. Amara broke that silence within her first week simply by being herself. She struck up conversations with Ms. Han, the head housekeeper, asking about her family, her favorite foods, the meaning behind the small jade pendant she always wore. She hummed old Afrobeat songs while she wandered the halls in the mornings, her bare feet against the cold marble, and once, when she caught the youngest of the kitchen staff struggling to understand an English recipe left by a consulting nutritionist, she sat with the girl for nearly an hour, laughing over their shared confusion, translating patiently between two languages neither of them fully owned. Taemin noticed. He noticed the way laughter had started drifting from rooms that used to hold nothing but silence. He noticed his staff smiling more, moving with less rigidity, as though a window had been cracked open in a house that had been sealed shut for years. He noticed, most of all, that he had started coming home earlier than he needed to, telling himself it was to check on the pregnancy, knowing somewhere beneath that lie that it wasn't the pregnancy he was rushing back for. Their first real conflict came in the second week, over something as small as a locked door. Amara had been exploring, carefully, respectfully, she told herself, familiarizing herself with a space she would call home for the better part of a year, when she found a hallway on the east wing that ended in a door secured with a keypad lock, unlike any other door in the house. When she mentioned it casually at dinner, expecting nothing more than idle explanation, Taemin's entire demeanor shifted. "That part of the house isn't part of your arrangement," he said, his voice suddenly flat, controlled in a way that felt less like calm and more like restraint. "I wasn't trying to go in," Amara said. "I was curious. Is that a crime here too?" "It's not about crime. It's about boundaries. I'd appreciate you respecting mine." "Funny," Amara said, setting down her chopsticks with deliberate precision, "considering you've spent the last 2 weeks explaining to me, in extensive legal detail, exactly which boundaries of mine I'm not allowed to have." "That's different, is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you get secrets and I get surveillance." Taemin's jaw tightened, and for a moment Amara thought she had pushed too far, that she would see the version of him Grace had warned her about, cold, punishing, dangerous. Instead, he exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, though not all of it. "That room," he said quietly, "belonged to my father. I haven't opened it since he died. It isn't a matter of hiding something from you specifically. It's a matter of not being ready to face what's inside it myself. Amara studied him, surprised by the honesty, unprepared for how disarming it was to hear this powerful, controlled man admit to something as human as grief. "Then I'm sorry," she said, gentler now. "I didn't know." "There's very little you do know about me," he said, though there was no cruelty in it, only a kind of tired truth. "That's rather the point of keeping certain rooms locked, Miss Chukwu." "Amara," she said, "if we're going to spend the better part of a year sharing a roof, I'd rather you use my name." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Amara," he repeated, testing the shape of it in his mouth as though it were unfamiliar territory. "Very well." It was a small concession. It felt, somehow, enormous. The weeks that followed blurred into a strange, cautious rhythm. Amara attended medical appointments with a specialist who monitored the pregnancy with a thoroughness that bordered on obsessive, submitted to weekly check-ins with a therapist Taemin had insisted upon despite her initial protests, and slowly, without either of them fully acknowledging it, began sharing meals with him more evenings than not. She learned, in fragments, who he was beneath the reputation that preceded him through every room he entered. She learned that his mother had died when he was young, that his father, Kong Sung-woo, had raised him inside an empire built on ruthlessness, teaching him early that softness was a weakness rivals would exploit without mercy. She learned that Taemin had inherited not just wealth but a war, a network of alliances and enemies so tangled that trust had become, for him, a luxury he could no longer afford. "You don't trust anyone, do you?" she asked one night, months into the arrangement, the two of them sitting on the terrace as the city lights sprawled endlessly beneath them. "I trust results," Taemin said. "Results don't lie to you. People do." "That sounds exhausting." "It's efficient." "It's lonely," Amara corrected, and watched something in his expression falter, just slightly, like a crack finding its way through stone that had been under pressure for far too long. "Perhaps," he admitted, so quietly she almost missed it. It was around the 4th month that everything began to shift in ways neither of them had anticipated. There was a business dinner, one of the rare occasions Amara was required to attend, dressed in an elegant gown that felt like borrowed skin, where a group of Taemin's associates spoke to her with barely veiled condescension, their comments cloaked in polite Korean phrases she understood only through tone and expression. She held her composure through most of it, years of quiet dignity carrying her through insult after insult, until one man made a remark that drew laughter from the table and caused Taemin to go rigid beside her. He stood so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. The room fell silent instantly, the kind of silence that only fear could produce. Taemin said something low and clipped in Korean, his voice carrying a menace Amara had never heard directed at her, only ever witnessed secondhand in the way people spoke about him. The man who had made the comment turned pale, stammered an apology, and the dinner resumed as though nothing had happened, though the air in the room never quite returned to what it had been. Later, in the car, Amara turned to him. "Why did that bother you so much?" "Because they were disrespecting you," Taemin said, staring straight ahead, his hands tight on his knees. "That's not the answer I expected." "What did you expect?" "Something about protecting your investment. Protecting the contract." "Not," she gestured vaguely, searching for the word, "not that." Taemin finally looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression that made her breath catch. "You are not an investment to me, Amara." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them was prepared for. That was the night the first real crack appeared in the wall he had spent his entire life building. He told her about his father that evening, sitting in the dim light of the study, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. He told her how Sung-woo had taught him that vulnerability was currency for enemies, how he had learned to swallow every fear, every grief, every soft feeling, before it could be used against him. He told her, almost in a whisper, that he could not remember the last time he had cried, not even at his father's funeral, because some deeply buried part of him still believed his father was watching, judging, waiting for him to prove himself weak. Amara did not offer pity. She had learned, in the months she'd spent inside his world, that pity was the one thing Taemin could not tolerate. Instead, she said simply, being afraid of losing people doesn't mean you have to control everyone around you to keep them. He had no answer for that. He simply sat there, in the dim light, looking at her as though she had said something he had needed to hear his entire life and had never once allowed himself to. It was 2 weeks later that Amara found the photograph. She hadn't meant to go looking. She had simply been searching for a book she remembered seeing on a shelf in the study, moving quietly through a room she rarely entered, when a loose folder slid from between two heavier volumes and spilled its contents across the floor. Old documents, yellowed with age. A handful of photographs. One of them stopped her cold. It showed a young woman, dressed in the fashion of the late 90s, standing beside a man Amara recognized instantly despite his younger face, Kong Sung-woo, Taemin's father. The woman was laughing at something outside the frame, her head tilted back, her features so achingly familiar that Amara's hands began to tremble before her mind had even fully processed why. The woman looked like her. Not similar. Not coincidentally alike. She looked like Amara might look if someone had taken her own reflection and aged it back 30 years, transplanted it into a different decade, a different country. She turned the photograph over with shaking fingers. Written on the back, in faded ink, Lagos, 1998. Amara sat frozen on the study floor for a long time, the photograph trembling in her grip, the city humming faintly beyond the windows, utterly indifferent to the earthquake quietly detonating inside her chest. Because if this photograph was real, if this woman standing beside Taemin's father in Lagos, nearly 3 decades ago, was who Amara was beginning to suspect she was, then nothing about how she had arrived in this house, in this contract, in this life, had been the coincidence she had believed it to be. Somewhere down the hall, she heard footsteps approaching, unhurried, familiar. Taemin's voice called out, warm in a way she hadn't heard from him in weeks. Amara, are you in here? She looked down at the photograph one last time, at the woman's face that mirrored her own too closely to be chance, and she understood, with a certainty that settled cold and absolute in her stomach, that everything she thought she knew about why she had been chosen for this arrangement was about to unravel completely. She stood, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand, and turned toward the door just as he stepped into the room. Taemin, she said, and her voice did not sound like her own. I need you to tell me who this woman is. And I need you to tell me the truth. His eyes dropped to the photograph in her hand, and for the first time since she had met him, for the first time in what she suspected was years, Kong Taemin looked genuinely, completely afraid. The silence between them stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of confession. Where did you find that? He finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Does it matter? Tell me who she is. He crossed the room slowly, as though every step cost him something, and reached for the photograph with a gentleness that surprised her. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he spoke again. I don't know for certain, he admitted, but I have a suspicion that terrifies me more than anything I have ever faced in this life. And if I'm right, Amara, it means my father brought you into this house for reasons that have nothing to do with the contract you signed. Amara felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Then find out, she said, her voice shaking now, all pretense of composure gone. Because I did not fly across the world, sign my name away, and carry a child inside me for 9 months just to become a pawn in some secret your father buried before he died. Taemin met her eyes, and in them she saw something she had never expected to find in a man built entirely of control and calculation. Raw, unguarded fear, tangled inextricably with something that looked, unmistakably, like love he hadn't yet allowed himself to name. I will find out, he promised. Even if the truth destroys everything I've built to protect us both. That night, sleep refused to come for either of them. Amara lay in the dark of her room, one hand resting instinctively over the gentle curve of her stomach, replaying the photograph in her mind again and again until the woman's laughing face blurred with her own reflection, until she could no longer tell where memory ended and imagination began. She thought of her mother, gone 5 years now, and of the strange silences that had sometimes settled over their small flat in Lagos whenever a Korean drama played on a neighbor's television, silences her mother never explained and Amara had never thought to question. She thought of the small wooden box her mother had kept locked in the bottom of her wardrobe, the one Amara had never been allowed to open, the one she had assumed, in her grief, had been lost during the move after the funeral. Perhaps it hadn't been lost at all. Perhaps it was still sitting in Igioma's storage room in Lagos, waiting for a truth its owner had never been brave enough, or safe enough, to reveal. Down the hall, Taemin sat alone in his study with a photograph propped against the lamp on his desk, staring at his father's younger face as though it might finally answer the questions the man had refused to answer in life. Kong Sung-woo had been a man of iron discipline and colder silences, a father who taught his son to read balance sheets before he taught him to ride a bicycle, who spoke of love the way other men spoke of weakness, rarely, and only ever as a warning. And yet here, in this single photograph, was a version of his father Tae-min had never known. A man laughing freely beside a woman who was not his wife, in a country an ocean away from the one he ruled, in a year that, Tae-min now realized with a chill crawling slowly up his spine, was exactly 9 months before a date etched permanently into his memory. The date, buried in old family records he had never thought to question, of a half-sibling his father had once mentioned only once, drunk and grieving on the anniversary of a loss he refused to name, before sealing the subject away forever. Tae-min had been 8 years old the night his father spoke those slurred, aching words. He had not understood them then. He was beginning, with mounting dread, to understand them now. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he had not called in over a year, a private investigator his father had once used for matters too delicate for ordinary channels, a woman named Song Mi-rae whose discretion was as legendary as her thoroughness. "Mr. Kong," she answered, her voice cool and alert despite the late hour. "It's been some time." "I need everything you can find," Tae-min said, his voice low, controlled, betraying nothing of the storm raging beneath it, "on a woman who may have known my father in Lagos, Nigeria, in the year 1998. And I need it discreetly, Ms. Song. No one, not my board, not my associates, not anyone within these walls, can know I'm asking. That's a very old trail to follow. Then follow it carefully. But follow it fast." He ended the call and sat back in his chair, the city sprawled silent and glowing beyond the window, and allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to feel truly afraid of what the truth might cost him. Because somewhere beneath the calculated empire he had spent his entire adult life protecting, beneath the contracts and the silence and the carefully constructed walls, Tae-min understood with sudden, terrible clarity that he had not simply hired a surrogate 9 months ago. He had, without either of them knowing it, welcomed home a piece of a secret his father had spent 30 years and an entire fortune trying to bury. And somewhere in Lagos, inside a locked wooden box gathering dust in a relative's storeroom, the first thread of that secret was waiting to be pulled. Outside, the lights of Seoul burned on, oblivious to the storm quietly gathering inside the walls of that house, a storm that had been 30 years in the making, waiting patiently for the day two strangers from opposite ends of the earth would finally collide with a past neither of them had known they shared. The days that followed moved with a strange, suspended quality, as though the entire house had learned to hold its breath alongside its 2 inhabitants. Amara continued her routines outwardly, the medical checkups, the quiet mornings in the kitchen, the slow, careful choreography of a pregnancy now well into its final trimester, but beneath the surface, something had shifted permanently. She found herself watching Tae-min differently, searching his face for answers he did not yet have, and she found him watching her the same way, as though trying to memorize something he feared he might lose. 5 days after the photograph, Song Mi-rae requested an in-person meeting. She arrived at the residence just after 9 in the evening, a slim woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and the unhurried composure of someone who had spent decades unearthing other people's secrets without ever revealing her own. She carried a slim folder, and the moment she set it on the study table, Amara felt the air in the room change. "I'll speak plainly," Mi-rae said, glancing between the two of them. "What I found is not simple, and it is not comfortable. If you would prefer to hear it separately dash." "No," Amara said, before Tae-min could answer. "Whatever it is, I want to hear it directly. I've spent 9 months of my life inside this story. I won't be shielded from its ending." Mi-rae inclined her head, a flicker of respect passing over her expression, and opened the folder. "Your father," she began, addressing Tae-min, traveled to Lagos in early 1998, officially for a shipping and logistics negotiation with a Nigerian trading partner. Unofficially, records suggest he remained in the country for nearly 4 months, far longer than any business trip required. During that time, he became closely associated with a young Nigerian woman named Adiz Chukwu. The name struck the room like a physical blow. Amara's hand flew instinctively to her chest. "That's my mother's name." "Yes," Mi-rae said gently. "I believe it is." "Continue," Tae-min said, his voice tight. "Adiz worked as a translator and cultural liaison for the trade delegation your father led. From what I could piece together through old correspondence and financial records, their relationship became personal. Deeply so. There are wire transfers from your father's private accounts to an account in Adiz's name spanning nearly 2 years after his return to Korea, payments that stopped abruptly in early 2000, around the same time Adiz Chukwu is recorded as having left her position and relocated within Lagos. Around the same time, Amara said slowly, doing the arithmetic her mind had already begun assembling with dread, that I was born. Mireille did not answer directly, but the silence that followed was answer enough. There's more, she continued carefully. In 1999, your father amended a private trust, separate from the corporate holdings, separate from anything ever disclosed to the board or to Korean tax authorities. The trust was established for the benefit of, and I quote the original language, any child born of Adiz Chukwu, to be honored and provided for upon proof of lineage, regardless of circumstance or distance. The trust was never activated. As far as I can determine, your father never made contact with Adiz again after 2000, and the funds sat untouched, growing quietly, for over 2 decades. Amara felt the room tilt around her. She sat down hard in the nearest chair, one hand pressed flat against her stomach as though to steady the child inside her along with herself. "Are you telling me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that Kong Sung-woo is my father?" Mireille's silence was, once again, unbearably eloquent. "Which would make me dash." Amara turned to look at Taemin, horror dawning cold and absolute across her face as the full weight of what this meant crashed down on her at once. "Which would make you and I dash." "No," Taemin said quickly, his own face pale with the same dawning horror, though for a different, equally devastating reason. "Half-siblings. Not partners. Not dash," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence. His hands braced against the edge of the desk, as though the floor beneath him had genuinely given way. The child Amara carried was not his biological child at all. The arrangement had used a donor embryo, a detail buried deep in the clinical paperwork neither of them had thought twice about at the time. But the horror of the moment had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with the impossible, gutting realization that the two of them, who had spent 9 months slowly, carefully, achingly falling toward something neither had dared name aloud, might in fact be bound by blood. "There has to be a mistake," Amara said, her voice cracking. "There has to be." "I would not have brought this to you," Mireille said quietly, "without being certain. But I will say this, the DNA comparison is not yet complete. I obtained a sample from Mr. Kang's late father's estate archives, preserved medical records from a health screening decades ago. A direct comparison with Ms. Chukwu's DNA would settle this beyond any doubt. I would recommend that above all else." "Do it," Amara said immediately. "I need to know. Tonight, if you can manage it. I cannot carry this uncertainty for 1 more hour." The test results, Mireille explained, would take at least 48 hours to process, even with every resource Taemin's fortune could summon. Those 48 hours stretched into the longest of Amara's life. She did not sleep. She barely ate. She wandered the halls of the residence like a ghost haunting her own life, replaying every tender moment of the past 9 months, every dinner, every late-night conversation, every unguarded glance, and feeling each one curdle into something she could no longer trust. Had it been real, whatever had been building between them? Or had it been some horrifying echo of blood recognizing blood, dressed up in a language neither of them had understood? Taemin, for his part, retreated into the one place in the house he had avoided for 3 years, the locked room at the end of the east wing hallway, his father's private study, untouched since the funeral. He stood before the keypad for nearly 20 minutes before he finally entered the code, his fingers trembling in a way they had not trembled since he was a boy standing at his father's graveside, forcing himself not to cry in front of men who would have seen it as weakness. The room exhaled dust and silence as the door swung open. Inside, everything remained exactly as Sung-woo had left it, files stacked with obsessive precision, an old leather chair worn soft at the armrests, framed photographs of a life Taemin had only ever seen the public, curated version of. He moved slowly through the space, running his fingers along the spines of ledgers and folders, until he found, tucked inside a locked drawer he had to force open with a letter opener, a stack of letters bound with faded string. They were addressed, every single one, to Adiz. None of them, it seemed, had ever been sent. Taemin sat in his father's chair and read them one by one, and with every letter, the portrait of Kong Sung-woo he had carried his entire life, cold, controlled, incapable of tenderness, began to fracture and reassemble into something far more complicated, far more human, far more tragic than he had ever allowed himself to imagine. "I think of you and the life we could have built if I had been braver," one letter read, dated 2003. "I have a son now. I love him, but I do not know how to be soft with him the way I was soft with you, because softness cost me everything once, and I am too much of a coward to risk it again." Another, dated 2009. I hired someone to check on you, quietly, from a distance. I saw a photograph. There is a child. I do not know if the child is mine, and I am too afraid to ask, because if the answer is yes, I do not know what kind of man I would have to become to deserve forgiveness for the years I have already stolen. The final letter, dated only months before Sung-woo's death, was different from the rest, shorter, more urgent, written in a hand that trembled visibly across the page. If you are reading this, Tae-min, then I am gone, and I have run out of time to make things right myself. There is a trust in my private files, established for a woman named Adiz Chukwoo and any child of hers. I never activated it. I never had the courage to face what activating it would mean, that I abandoned someone I loved out of fear, and left a child to grow up not knowing where half of her blood, and half of her fortune, truly came from. I am asking you, my son, to finish what I could not. Find her. Find them. Make it right, even if making it right costs you everything you thought you understood about our family. And if fate, in its strange cruelty or mercy, ever brings that child into your life, protect her. Love her, if love is what she needs. Just do not become the kind of man who lets fear decide what he deserves. Tae-min sat alone in his father's study long after midnight, the letter trembling in his hands, and wept for the first time since he was 8 years old. The DNA results arrived on the third morning, delivered personally by Mi-rae with none of her usual composure fully intact. There is a familial match, she said quietly, watching Amara's face carefully as she absorbed the words. But it is not the match either of you feared. What do you mean? Tae-min asked. The comparison confirms a biological relationship between Ms. Chukwoo and Kong Sung-woo, Mi-rae said, but the relationship is not parent and child. The genetic markers indicate something more distant, consistent with an aunt or uncle relationship, not direct paternity. Amara stared at her, uncomprehending. I don't understand. Mi-rae opened her folder once more, revealing a second document, one that had apparently taken the additional 48 hours to properly authenticate. I went back further into the records, once the direct paternity test came back inconsistent. What I found is that Adiz Chukwoo had an older sister, your aunt, Amara, though I understand she may not have used that word with you. A woman named Chidinma, who died shortly after childbirth in early 2000. Adiz raised the child as her own, as was common practice, quietly, within the family, without ever formally correcting the record. That child was you, Amara. Adiz was your aunt by blood, and your mother in every way that mattered. And Chidinma's relationship with Kong Sung-woo, not Adiz, is what connects you to this family. The room went utterly silent. My mother, Amara whispered, was not my mother. She was, Tae-min said gently, moving toward her before he could stop himself, kneeling beside her chair. In every single way that counted, Amara, she was. Amara's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for 3 exhausting days, tears that finally broke free, not entirely of grief, but of something more complicated, some tangled combination of relief and devastation and a strange, aching gratitude that the woman who raised her, loved her, sacrificed for her, had chosen to be her mother even when biology had made no such demand of her. Then Kong Sung-woo is my uncle, Tae-min finished softly. Which makes us. He paused, searching for the word, something unreadable and hopeful and terrified moving across his face all at once. Not related. Not by blood. Only by an old, tangled thread of history neither of us knew we were standing inside. The relief that swept through Amara was so immense it left her light-headed, and beneath it, unbidden, rose something else entirely, the memory of every quiet moment she had shared with this man over the past 9 months, no longer poisoned by horror, but suddenly, achingly available to her again. Why did your father hide the trust for so long? She asked, once she had gathered enough composure to speak again. Why let 2 decades pass without ever reaching out? Fear, Tae-min said simply. The same fear that has run through this family for generations. Fear of scandal. Fear of vulnerability. Fear that loving someone means eventually losing them, and that losing them will be unbearable if you allow yourself to love them fully first. He looked at her then, and something in his gaze made her chest ache. I understand that fear better than I would like to admit. And now? Amara asked quietly. Now, Tae-min said, I would rather risk losing everything than spend one more day pretending I don't already love you. The words hung between them, fragile and enormous all at once. "Tae-min," Amara said carefully, "I came here to save my sister. I never expected Dash," she gestured helplessly between them, at the 9 months of careful walls that had somehow, impossibly, come tumbling down. "I never expected any of this." "Neither did I," he admitted. "I have spent my entire life believing love was a liability, something my enemies could use against me, something my father's own mistakes proved was too dangerous to risk. And then you arrived in my house, disrupting every carefully constructed rule I had built my life around, and I found myself wanting, for the first time, to be reckless enough to love someone anyway." Amara felt her resolve crumbling, felt the walls she had built to survive this arrangement, walls meant to protect her heart from a man she was never supposed to fall for, finally give way completely. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I didn't come here for you. I came here for my sister's life. But somewhere in the middle of all of this, I stopped counting the days until I could leave, and I started dreading them instead." Tae-min reached for her hand, and this time, she did not pull away. "Then don't leave," he said. "Not because a contract demands it. Not because of money or obligation, or any of the reasons that brought you here in the first place. Stay because you choose to. Because I am asking you, freely, with nothing binding you but whatever it is that has grown between us these past 9 months. Amara looked down at their joined hands, at the small, undeniable life growing inside her that had begun this entire impossible journey, and felt something inside her settle, finally, into place. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "There's still so much we don't know. Your father's trust, the inheritance connected to it, what it means for both of our families going forward. I don't even know what I'm going to tell Ifioma when she asks why I'm still in Seoul months after I was supposed to come home." "We'll figure it out," Tae-min said. "Together, if you'll let me." In the days that followed the revelation, Amara found herself renegotiating not just her understanding of her own history, but the very shape of her days inside that house. She no longer moved through the residence as a guest bound by contract, counting down toward an exit. She moved through it, cautiously, as someone beginning to imagine a life within its walls. There were still hard conversations to have. One evening, sitting across from Tae-min at the long dining table that had once felt so impossibly formal, Amara set down her spoon and looked at him directly. "I need you to understand something about me before this goes any further," she said. "I did not grow up with money. I do not know how to move through your world the way the women at that dinner moved through it. I will embarrass you eventually, Tae-min. I will say the wrong thing to the wrong investor, or laugh too loudly at the wrong function, and I need to know now whether that is something you can live with, or whether this, whatever this is between us, only works as long as I stay quiet and small." Tae-min set down his own chopsticks, and for a long moment he simply looked at her, something fierce and unguarded moving behind his eyes. "Amara," he said slowly, "the first night I met you, you told me I forgot a rule. You told me I did not get to treat you like property. Do you remember what I felt in that moment? Irritation, probably. Relief," he said. "For the first time in my adult life, someone was not afraid of me. Every single person who has walked into my world since my father died has measured their words around me, has performed some version of themselves they believed I wanted to see. You have never once done that. You have laughed too loudly in rooms that expected silence, and every single time, you have made those rooms more honest simply by refusing to shrink. I do not want you small, Amara. I have had small around me my entire life. It nearly killed whatever was left of me." Amara felt her throat tighten. "That's a very charming answer." "It's the truth," Tae-min said. "Though I understand if you'd prefer charming." Despite everything, the exhaustion, the grief, the impossible weight of the last several days, Amara found herself laughing, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere deep and unguarded, and watching him across the table, she saw something in his face loosen in response, as though her laughter alone had given him permission to breathe fully for the first time in longer than either of them could remember. It was not the last hard conversation they had. There was the matter of the trust itself, which Tae-min insisted on activating in full, transferring control of a portion of it directly to Amara regardless of what she chose to do about their relationship going forward. "I don't want your father's guilt money," Amara told him flatly, the first time he raised it. "I didn't come here to inherit anything. I came here to save my sister, and I did that with the compensation I earned honestly, through the arrangement I signed. I won't take the rest simply because an old man felt guilty enough to write my mother's name into a legal document he was too much of a coward to ever act on while he was alive. It isn't only about guilt, Taemin said. It's about what's owed. Whatever my father's failures, Amara, Chidinma was his responsibility, and by extension, so are you. Refusing the trust does not undo what happened. It only means his silence wins one final time, even after death. Amara considered this for a long time before finally, reluctantly, agreeing to a compromise. The funds would be placed not in her name directly, but into a foundation established in her mother's honor, one designed to support Nigerian women pursuing medical treatment abroad, the very kind of desperate, high-stakes gamble that had first brought Amara into this house. It felt, to her, like the only way to make something honest out of something that had begun in secrecy and shame. Taemin agreed without hesitation, and within days, lawyers were drafting the foundation's charter, a small, strange miracle rising out of the wreckage of 30 years of silence. Ifeoma, once she was strong enough to travel, insisted on visiting Seoul herself, determined to see with her own eyes the country and the man responsible for the sister. She nearly lost her to a hospital bed forever. She arrived thinner than Amara remembered, but with color in her cheeks and a spark in her eyes that had been absent for over a year, and the moment she stepped into the residence, she took one look around at the marble floors and the towering windows and turned to her sister with an expression of pure, unfiltered disbelief. "You didn't tell me you were living in a palace," Ifeoma said. "It didn't feel like the most important detail at the time," Amara said, laughing despite herself. Ifeoma studied Taemin carefully over dinner that evening, asking pointed questions about his intentions with a bluntness that made even Amara wince. Though Taemin answered every single one without flinching, his composure never once slipping, even when Ifeoma asked, quite directly, whether he intended to marry her sister or simply keep her indefinitely as some kind of beautiful secret. "I intend," Taemin said carefully, holding Ifeoma's gaze with the same steady seriousness he brought to every negotiation that mattered to him, "to spend the rest of my life earning the right to ask her that question properly, when the time is right, and when she is ready to hear it. Not before." Ifeoma looked at him for a long moment, then turned to her sister with an expression that was equal parts approval and disbelief. "He's very serious for someone who runs half the underground economy of Seoul." "You have no idea," Amara said, smiling despite the exhaustion of the last several weeks finally beginning to settle into her bones. 3 weeks later, Amara gave birth in a private wing of Seoul's finest hospital, Taemin at her side the entire time, gripping her hand with a fierceness that betrayed every ounce of the fear he had spent his life trying to suppress. The child, a healthy baby girl, arrived just after 2 in the morning, her cry cutting through the sterile hospital silence like the opening note of an entirely new song. Amara held her only briefly, for the arrangement Grace had negotiated so carefully all those months ago, before the intended parents, a quiet Korean-American couple who had been unable to carry a pregnancy of their own, arrived to take their daughter home. It should have felt like an ending. Instead, standing in that hospital room with Taemin's arms steady around her shoulders, Amara understood, with a clarity that startled her, that it felt like the beginning of something else entirely. There was a moment, in the quiet aftermath of the birth, when Amara found herself standing alone at the nursery window, watching the intended parents cradle their new daughter with a tenderness that made her chest ache with a complicated mixture of joy and grief. She had known, going into the arrangement, that this moment would come. She had prepared herself for it in every way a person could prepare for something so profoundly unpreparable. And still, when it arrived, it knocked the breath from her lungs in a way no amount of counseling sessions had managed to fully soften. Taemin found her there 20 minutes later, standing in the same spot, her hand pressed flat against the cool glass. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I don't know," Amara admitted. "I thought I would feel relief. Mostly I just feel hollow. Is that strange?" "No," Taemin said. "I think it would be strange if you felt nothing at all." They stood together in silence for a long while, watching the small, swaddled bundle through the glass, until finally Amara turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said, "for not trying to fix this feeling. For just standing here with it instead." "I am learning," Taemin said, "that some things are not meant to be fixed, only witnessed." It was a small thing, that sentence, and yet it settled something in Amara that she had not realized needed settling. A quiet confirmation that whatever this man had once been, whatever cold, controlled version of himself he had built to survive his father's world, he was no longer entirely that man. He had learned, in 9 short months, to sit inside discomfort without trying to command it into submission, and for Amara, That transformation meant more than any grand declaration of love could have. Ifeoma's surgery had already been completed 2 months prior, funded in full, successful beyond even the doctor's cautious optimism. Amara had flown home briefly to sit at her sister's bedside as she recovered, watching color return to Ifeoma's cheeks for the first time in over a year, and had wept with a relief so total it left her hollowed out and grateful in equal measure. It was during that brief trip home that Amara finally opened the box. Auntie Ijeoma had kept it all these years, exactly as Adiz had left it, tucked in the back of a storage closet Amara had never thought to search. Inside, beneath old photographs and yellowing letters, Amara found the confirmation of everything Mireille had uncovered: her mother's careful, heartbroken account of raising her sister's child as her own, of the Korean businessman who had once loved Chidinma fiercely and lost her too soon, of a trust fund Adiz had known about but never touched, some fierce, protective pride refusing to let her daughter grow up defined by a fortune she hadn't earned. But tucked at the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was a photograph Amara had never seen before. The same young Korean man from the earlier photograph, but older now, standing beside a different woman entirely, a Nigerian woman who was unmistakably, heartbreakingly, not Chidinma at all. Amara turned it over with trembling fingers. The handwriting, once again, was Kong Sung-woo's. When they discover the truth about the second child, everything will change. Forgive me for the silence. I did not know how to carry 2 secrets at once. Amara stared at the photograph for a long time, her mind racing through the implications, through questions she did not yet have answers to. A second child. A second secret her mother's family had somehow been tangled inside, one that had nothing to do with Chidinma, nothing to do with the story she and Taemin had spent the last several weeks so carefully piecing together. She brought the photograph back to Seoul, back to the man who had, against every expectation either of them had carried into this arrangement, become the one person she trusted enough to face whatever came next. Taemin studied the photograph for a long time in the dim light of his study, his expression shifting from confusion to something far more troubled. "I don't recognize this woman," he said slowly. "But I recognize this photograph's setting. It was taken in this house. In that room." He nodded toward the hallway, toward the locked study that had, until recently, held nothing but grief and old letters. "There's another secret," Amara said quietly, watching his face. "Isn't there? Something even your father's letters didn't tell you." Taemin set the photograph down carefully, his jaw tight, his eyes distant with the particular exhaustion of a man who had believed, only hours earlier, that he had finally reached the bottom of his family's buried history, only to discover, with quiet dread, that the ground beneath him had simply opened onto another layer entirely. "If there is a second child," he said slowly, "then somewhere out there, Amara, we may not be the only ones caught inside my father's unfinished promises." Mireille was summoned back to the residence the following morning, the mysterious photograph laid out on the study desk between the 3 of them once more. She examined it for a long time in silence, turning it over, studying the faded ink of Sung-woo's handwriting, before finally looking up with an expression Amara had not yet seen on her, genuine uncertainty. "I will need time," Mireille said. "This woman does not match any record I uncovered during my initial search. If she exists in your father's history, Mr. Kong, he buried her far more carefully than he buried Chidinma. It's possible there are other private accounts, other trusts, other correspondence I have not yet located. It's possible this goes back further than either of us has considered." "How much further?" Taemin asked. "I don't know yet," Mireille admitted. "But I intend to find out." That evening, Amara sat on the terrace with Taemin, the city sprawled beneath them in its endless, indifferent glow, and allowed herself, for the first time since the photograph had surfaced, to simply exist inside the uncertainty rather than fight against it. "Are you afraid?" she asked him. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of what we might find. Of what it might cost us to find it. My father spent 30 years running from these secrets, Amara, and it destroyed him slowly, from the inside, in ways I only fully understood after his death. I do not want to become a man who runs the same way." "Then we won't run," Amara said, reaching for his hand. "Whatever this second secret turns out to be, we'll face it the way we faced the first one. Together, and honestly, no matter what it costs." Taemin turned to look at her, something fierce and grateful moving across his face in the low evening light. "I do not deserve you," he said quietly. "No," Amara agreed, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. But you're stuck with me anyway. Somewhere below them, the city continued its endless hum, oblivious to the quiet vow being made on that terrace, two people, bound not by blood after all, but by something they were only beginning to trust enough to call love, choosing each other in the full, unfinished mess of a story that was, they both understood now, only just beginning. Because whoever the woman in that final photograph was, and whatever secret still waited to be uncovered in the tangled history of the Kong family, one truth had already made itself unmistakably clear to both of them that night. Some mysteries take a lifetime to unravel, and Amara and Taemin had, against every possible odd, decided to spend that lifetime unraveling this one side by side. Outside, the lights of Seoul stretched endlessly toward the horizon, indifferent as ever to the quiet, seismic shifts unfolding within the walls of that house. A family rebuilt from secrets, a love neither of them had planned for, and a photograph that suggested, unmistakably, that the story was far from finished. Thank you, truly, from the bottom of our hearts, for staying with this story all the way to the end. If any part of it moved you, made you smile, or kept you guessing, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button, and drop a comment letting us know which moment hit you hardest. We read every single one, and they genuinely mean so much to us. We'd also love to know which city or country you're watching from tonight. It never stops amazing us how far these stories travel. Until the next one, take care of yourselves, and stay blessed.